So our application doesn't look too bad. We can certainly do some things here. Now, one thing we can't really do at the moment is add a new place. Now, one important note at this point, whilst we can, of course, add everything we need to add a new place, so the form inputs and so on, what we'll not build at this point of the course is a real functionality to add a new place to the list of places here, for the simple reason that we have no backend yet where we could store that new place. Now, we could absolutely use something like Redux to manage application-wide state in our frontend app here, and therefore manage our places locally in the browser. But this is not what we need later in the course. There, we don't want to manage all our data just locally in the browser. Instead, we want to manage it on a server to also share it with other users and not just have it on our machine, on our running instance of the React app. So therefore, I will add the add place functionality now, but will not wire it up to our list of places because here in our code, of course, we only have a dummy list of places anyways, right? We have the dummy places here, and for now we'll not add any functionality to manage this application wide because, as I mentioned, we'll do this on a server later. Nonetheless, let's work on the new place page here and let's make sure that we actually can add a new place so that we do have all the inputs for that and that we can at least get to the point where we would be ready to send the place off to a server. For that, we need to build a form in new place. I want to return a form here instead of a h2 tag. And on that form, I'll add a class name of place-form. You can, of course, use any class you want. And in there, I want to have a couple of inputs and also a submit button in the end. Now, for the inputs, we could, of course, use the regular HTML inputs and combine that with, let's say, label components. But I want to create my own component, which combines both and that's important, which also has built-in user input validation. My idea is that we have some kind of input component, which we could use like this. And that on this input component, we can configure it. We can give it a type of text, for example. We can give it a label of title. And we can also add a validators property, which should take an array of predefined validation rules, which we'll also have to create. So quite a complex component, which does not just render some visuals to the screen, but which, as I just said, also has some built-in logic for validating user input and so on. So that by the end, when this component is finished, we have an onChange prop there, which triggers a function on every keystroke and gives us not just the input, not just the text the user entered, but also some information whether that input is valid, so that we have the validation built into the inputs and we don't have to do it here in this new place component. That's again this idea of splitting code and of outsourcing things. So step by step, let's first of all build a simple input which just outputs something visually, and then later as a next step let's add the validation. As a last step, we'll then also add validation to the entire form, where I basically want to sum up the different validation results of the individual inputs and decide whether the overall form is valid or not. But that will be the last step. So let's go to form elements then, and in there let's add a new input.js file and an input.css file to add, well, this component I was just talking about. And as I said, this will be a complex component, so we'll spend some time on it. We start simple though. We import React from React here, and then we have our input component, which receives some props and which will have some logic in there, and we export this. And of course, we should also import the CSS styling here, so /input CSS. Also, a little side note at this point, there are third-party libraries like Formic, which you can use in React to get form functionality for free, so to say. So to simply install that library, and then you can set up forms and form inputs with it and use that to handle validations on. You could absolutely do that, and you can look into solutions like that. But in my courses, I'm always a big fan of teaching the topic at hand in depth. And I find it very interesting to see how form validation could be set up on your own and how you could build quite a sophisticated form input system without any third-party library. And therefore, that is what we'll do here. Back to our input component though. Here, I now want to return some JSX, and the JSX we do return here will be a div, which groups together a label and an input. And on that div, I want to assign some dynamic class names, form control, which will always be there. But in addition, I also want to be able to later add some dynamic class, so a class which will not always be added based on the validity of the input, so that we can, for example, color the label and the input field red if it's invalid. For now, we'll just have form control there, but we'll add more later. Inside of the div, we now need a label element, and there I want to output the text which is received on the label prop of our custom component. And there I'll also add HTML4 props ID. This here is basically the for attribute you have on a normal label as well. Just as the class attribute, for is a keyword in JavaScript. So here in JSX we can't use it, and hence we have HTML4, which will be translated to that regular for attribute once this is rendered to the DOM. Well, and then I expect to get some ID via props, and I pass this to HTML4. Then here I want to render the actual input. And there I want to be flexible. This input component should be able to render a regular input, but also a text area. So to cater for both, I will take a step back here and create an element, let's say, element constant. And the content of that depends on, let's say, an element prop, where we can decide from outside which kind of element we want to render. And if the element prop holds a value of input, then element, so this element constant here, will store an input element. Otherwise, it will store a text area, like this. Now, of course, we need to configure both now. The input here will receive some props, the ID, for example, props ID, and also the type, props.type, so that we can decide from outside which type of input we create, text, number, and so on. We also might want to be able to set a placeholder text with props placeholder. And that's it for now. We'll add more later, but for the moment, that is it. On the text area, we also can set the ID of this element. And we also might want to be able to set the rows from outside. So we can set this to props rows or to a default of 3, let's say, with this fallback value in case the rows prop is not defined. Now for the moment, that's it. Below the label, we can now output the element. So here, a dynamic expression, because I'm referring to a JavaScript expression here. I'm outputting the value of element after all, and the value of element is either input or text area. So that's getting rendered down there. With that, we have a very simple input or a form control set up. Now it's also time for some styling, and for that, attached you find an input CSS file, where you can just paste the content into this input CSS file. And you will also find a new place CSS file, where you can paste your content in, and make sure that in new place.js you import that new place CSS file, of course. And this will ensure that the entire form is styled properly. Now in new place.js, we can also import the input component now. So import input from, and then let's go to the shared folder, components, form elements, input, and this should therefore work. Now let's see if it works, and for that we'll need to specify one extra thing here. Keep in mind that in our newly added input component, we require the element prop to render either an input or a text area. So if we don't specify it, we'll always render a text area, but if we don't want a text area, we have to add an element prop and set this value to input. So here in the new place component, I will add element and set this to input here. With that, if we save this, we get this simple form. Not super amazing, but a good starting point. Of course, at the moment, there is no built-in validation or anything like that. So before we add more and more inputs, let's actually focus on that built-in logic and validation part.